You never know who you're going to get. One day they're warm, present, charming. The next they're distant, cold, explosive. And it's not always shouting. Sometimes it's silence, a sudden mood shift, an emotional wall that appears out of nowhere. You're left confused, wondering what you did wrong. But here's the twist. It was never about you. It was about a wound that had nothing to do with this moment. You just happened to touch it. Carl Jung called these wounds complexes, unseen forces living inside us, repeating pain that was never resolved. And when someone hasn't met their own ghosts, those ghosts start to live through you. You begin to shrink, to silence yourself, to walk on eggshells just to keep things calm. But that's not calm. That's survival. In this video, we're going to break the silence around people who are emotionally unstable, not because they're evil, but because they've been colonized by pain. You'll learn how these people unconsciously manipulate reality, drain your energy, and make you question your own sanity. More importantly, you'll see why it keeps happening, and what to do if you're caught in the loop. If you've ever felt like your love wasn't enough, if you've ever tiptoed around someone just to avoid another outburst, if you've ever lost yourself trying to rescue someone else, then this might be the most important video you'll watch this year, because some people aren't toxic by nature. They're just haunted, and you're the one paying the price. They smile at you, they laugh, hold your hand, share a story, and just when you think you finally found peace, something shifts. You say the wrong word, you forget to reply, you look away for a second too long, and suddenly they're gone, not physically, but emotionally. Their warmth turns to fire, accusations flood the room, and you're left wondering, what did I do? But the truth is, it wasn't you. You didn't trigger them. You awakened something far older, something buried. Carl Jung called it a complex, a psychological splinter, still bleeding, still alive, now acting like a ghost inside them. And you? You're just the stage it chose to reappear. Every emotional outburst that feels out of proportion is rarely about the moment. It's about a history no one saw. Maybe when they were 7, a parent forgot to pick them up from school. That silence became a blueprint for abandonment. So now, when you show up 5 minutes late, they don't see you. They see the child left alone on the curb. Their body floods with panic. Their mind rewrites the moment. And suddenly you're the villain in a story you never lived. This is how psychological triggers work. They bypass logic. They hijack perception. They pull the person into a past timeline and trap you inside it with them. The problem is, they don't know this is happening. Most people don't. When the complex activates, it feels real, urgent, justified. They'll swear it's your fault, that you've changed, that something's off. But in reality, they've left the present. Their unconscious mind has taken over the wheel, and you're speaking to a frightened child in adult skin. And if you try to argue, to explain, to defend yourself, it only makes things worse. Because now, you're not just the villain, you're also gaslighting them. In their eyes, at least. This is the madness of complex psychology. No one knows who's actually driving, and it doesn't just end after the fight. No, trauma responses linger. They collapse into tears, apologize, and say they didn't mean it. And in that moment, you see something heartbreaking. A deep, wounded inner child who doesn't want to hurt you, but has no idea how to stop. You remember the warmth, the tenderness, so you forgive, you stay, you believe, once again, that this time it will be different. But the storm always returns, because love doesn't fix what hasn't been faced, and you can't heal someone else's childhood by being nicer in their adulthood. What makes this so confusing is how believable the shift feels. 1 minute they're charming, present, loving. The next, they're a stranger. Their eyes change, their voice tightens, they become distant or aggressive, and your nervous system doesn't know what to expect anymore. That's the danger. Over time, your brain adapts to chaos. You begin to monitor their moods, avoid certain topics, speak in softer tones. You lose your spontaneity, your joy, and all in the name of peace, a peace that never really comes, because you're not dealing with a person. You're dealing with a haunted house built by memory and childhood trauma. Here's the deeper truth. Shadow work is the only path to freedom. Until they face the part of themselves that's frozen in pain, the past will keep reappearing. Not in memories, but in you. You will play the villain, the abandoner, the betrayer. Not because you are, but because the script needs someone to fill the role. And if they refuse to wake up to their patterns, the pattern becomes your prison. This is the hidden tyranny of unconscious living. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This isn't fate. It's avoidance disguised as normalcy. So what do? You stop trying to win the unwinnable war. You stop explaining yourself to a ghost. And most importantly, you stop blaming yourself for reactions you didn't create. Their wounds are not your responsibility. And while compassion is noble, self-destruction is not. You can't love someone out of a complex they refuse to see. The only hope is that they choose to look inward, to pause when triggered, to ask, "Where have I felt this before?" That question can break the spell, but only if they're ready, only if they're brave enough to feel the pain, instead of transferring it to you. But most aren't, and the tragedy is this. The people who suffer most in these relationships aren't the unstable ones. It's the stable ones. The grounded, the consistent, the emotionally available. Because their steadiness becomes the perfect backdrop for chaos to unfold. And slowly, they begin to doubt themselves, their memory, their worth. Until one day, they're the one having the outburst. The roles reverse, the trauma spreads, and no one knows where it started anymore. But it did start. And the only way to stop it is to recognize the ghost behind the person and the price you're paying to keep pretending it's not there. And sometimes the ghost isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't explode. It whispers. It clings. It hides behind smiles and soft words. It drains instead of destroys. And by the time you notice, you're already empty. That's the kind of ghost we'll meet next. The one who feeds on your energy without ever raising their voice. It starts small. You hesitate before speaking. You double-check your words. You replay yesterday's conversation in your head, trying to spot what might have gone wrong. And then, without realizing it, you're living in constant anticipation, waiting for the next shift, the next storm, the next subtle withdrawal of love. This is what it means to live on eggshells. Not around a bad person, but around a deeply wounded one, whose emotional dysregulation has become the atmosphere you breathe. And your body? It's listening. Every flinch, every silence, every sigh you hold in, it's all recorded by your nervous system. Until it stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like home. Over time, your nervous system stops trusting peace. Calm becomes suspicious. Joy feels unfamiliar. You anticipate tension even when things seem fine. This is called nervous system dysregulation, and it's what happens when your body learns that safety is unpredictable. It rewires itself for survival. You stay hypervigilant, always on alert for mood shifts, tone changes, micro-rejections. And because you care, you try to fix it. You become the peacekeeper, the emotional translator, the self-silencer. But the cost is high. You lose your spontaneity, your confidence, your voice. And eventually, the most dangerous thing happens. You lose sight of who you were before the chaos began. This isn't love. It's trauma bonding, a psychological loop where pain and comfort come from the same source. They hurt you, then soothe you. Withdraw, then embrace. And your brain, confused by the cycle, starts to equate inconsistency with intimacy. This is how you get addicted to dysfunction. You crave the highs, so you endure the lows. And soon, even your identity begins to erode. You forget your preferences, your values, your needs, all in the name of keeping the peace. But this isn't peace. It's self-abandonment wrapped in loyalty. And the longer you stay, the more invisible you become to yourself. People often think emotional abuse is loud, obvious, violent, but most of the time, it's quiet. It's the look that makes you shrink, the silence that makes you panic, the mood that infects the whole room. And it doesn't leave bruises. It leaves confusion, doubt, relationship anxiety. You start second-guessing your memory. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too dramatic. But that's the trap, because the more unsure you feel, the more dependent you become. And that dependency is the real prison. You stay not because you're weak, but because your body thinks leaving might be more dangerous than staying. There's a name for this: codependency. It's when your sense of worth gets tied to someone else's stability. Their approval becomes your oxygen. Their moods dictate your day. And deep down, you believe if you can just love them the right way, they'll finally become safe. But they won't. Not because they're incapable, but because they haven't chosen healing. They haven't looked at their wounds. And until they do, their pain will keep leaking into the relationship, no matter how hard you try to hold it all together. You're not a healer. You're a human. And even the strongest humans break under chronic tension. What most people don't realize is that the body remembers. Long after the apologies, the promises, the good days, your body still flinches, still braces, still doesn't feel safe. And that's the scar of prolonged emotional tension. The survival mode never shuts off. You live with a background noise of stress. Even when you're alone, you don't feel alone. Their presence echoes in your nervous system. You replay old fights, rehearse imaginary ones, and you wonder why you're always tired. The answer? You're not just emotionally exhausted. You're neurologically burnt out, because your body has been running a marathon with no finish line. Here's the cruel twist. The more dysregulated you become, the harder it is to leave. Because your mind can't think clearly in a constant state of tension. You normalize the abnormal. You romanticize the rare good moments. And you demonize your own needs. This is what identity erosion looks like. You shrink. You adapt. You survive. And the more you survive, the more you convince yourself that this is what love requires. But love doesn't erase you. It reveals you. If you have to become less of yourself to keep the relationship intact, you're not in a relationship. You're in a trauma loop. And perhaps the hardest part is that you remember who they used to be, or who they are when they're kind. That's the bait. That's what keeps you hoping. But the real question isn't whether they're good or bad. It's whether they're safe. Because emotional safety isn't a bonus. It's the baseline. And if you're not safe, nothing else matters. Not the memories. Not the potential. Not the apologies. And if this sounds familiar, you're not crazy. You're just tired. And in the next topic, we'll talk about what happens when the pain isn't loud, but constant. When someone doesn't explode, but quietly consumes you, bit by bit. You don't remember when it started, but somehow your world began to shrink. You stopped laughing as freely. You hesitated before sharing good news. You felt guilty for being happy around them. Not because they told you to, but because every light you carried seemed to cast a shadow on them. This is how it begins. Not with a scream, but with a subtle shift. You're no longer living your life. You're adjusting to theirs. Their moods shape your days. Their wounds control your choices. You are no longer you. You've been colonized, not by force, but by history. Their history. Their complex trauma. Most people think trauma is personal. But trauma spreads, especially through relationships. What Jung called psychological possession is more than a metaphor. It's when an unhealed wound takes the wheel and starts driving the relationship. And if you're close to someone who hasn't faced their darkness, you become a character in their internal drama. Not by choice, but by absorption. Their anxiety becomes your baseline. Their silence becomes your guilt. And before long, you're no longer responding to life. You're reacting to someone else's emotional weather. This is the hidden cost of trauma transfer. You inherit pain you never lived. And if you're empathic, it's even worse. You sense their sadness before they speak. You adjust your energy without realizing it. You internalize their chaos like it's your responsibility. This is emotional contagion, and it's real. Studies have shown that the brain's mirror neurons can literally synchronize to another person's stress. So you're not imagining it. You are carrying what's not yours. And over time, that load begins to weigh on your body, your sleep, your joy. You lose access to your own emotional truth because you've been trained, silently, subtly, to prioritize theirs above all else. This is what psychic enmeshment looks like. The boundaries between you and the other person begin to blur. Their needs become law. Their pain becomes sacred. And your inner voice? Muffled. You feel guilty for pulling away. You feel selfish for needing space. But space is not abandonment. It's oxygen. And without it, you suffocate slowly until there's no you left. This isn't compassion, it's captivity. And if you've been stuck in this dynamic, chances are you've been told you're too sensitive, too cold, too much, or not enough. But the truth is, you've just been too accessible. Here's the irony. The people most affected by projection psychology are usually those trying hardest to help. You want to understand. You want to heal them. You think if you stay kind enough, calm enough, loving enough, they'll finally feel safe and stop hurting you. But that's not how projection works. When someone refuses to own their pain, they look for someone else to carry it. And often, they choose the person who seems the strongest, the kindest, the most patient. Not out of malice, but because their wound is trying to finish a story. One where someone finally stays and saves them. But you're not a savior. You're a soul with your own limits. The damage is gradual. You stop recognizing yourself. You say, "I'm fine," even when you're not. You feel drained after every conversation. You wake up tired. You avoid your own friends because explaining what's happening feels impossible. This is empath fatigue. It's not weakness. It's what happens when your nervous system has been in service to someone else's storm for too long. You were never meant to be their therapist, their parent, their emotional sponge. You were meant to be in a relationship. But now, it feels like a job. And the pay? It's your peace. And if you try to reclaim your space, they'll notice. They'll say you've changed, that you're distant, cold. But what they really mean is, you're not available for my projection anymore. And that's a threat to the dynamic, to the illusion, to the complex that's been living through you. This is why emotional boundaries are so hard to set in these relationships. Because the moment you draw a line, you disrupt a system that only worked because you kept abandoning yourself. But disruption is necessary. It's the first sign of awakening, of taking your life back from someone else's narrative. Because at the end of the day, you weren't put on this earth to carry someone else's ghosts. You can love them. You can pray for their healing, but you cannot live their story, especially when it's slowly erasing yours. And in the final part of this journey, we'll look at what Jung warned about. When a person refuses to meet their shadow, they don't just become chaotic, they become dangerous. Not with fists, but with inconsistency, with dependency, with silence. So now you know, it wasn't your fault. You weren't too much. You weren't unstable. You were just standing in the blast radius of someone else's unresolved war. But awareness is the first form of liberation. And once you can name the pattern, you can begin to escape it. Ask yourself, how many times have you silenced your truth to avoid setting someone off? How often have you mistaken instability for passion, inconsistency for depth, chaos for love? And how much of your life have you spent trying to fix someone who won't even look at their own wounds? Here's the truth. You don't need to fight their ghosts. You need to protect your peace. You don't need to save them. You need to choose you. And if they truly want healing, they'll meet you there, doing their own work, facing their own shadows, breaking their own cycles. Until then, remember this. Your empathy is powerful, but it should never become your prison. If this video brought clarity to something you've been feeling but couldn't explain, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join a space where we unpack the silent wars of the psyche, one truth at a time. Because your peace is not selfish, it's sacred, and maybe for the first time, it's time to protect it.